Pressure is growing on the Venezuelan President Nicholas Maduro, but can the international community convince him to resign? And how much difference will a new round of sanctions make to an economy that was already near collapse before this crisis began? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. My name's Peter Dobby. Internationally isolated and with the economy near collapse, pressure has been growing on the Venezuelan President Nicholas Maduro to step down. The list of countries recognising the National Assembly leader Juan Guaido as the interim president is growing, but the Maduro government, at least for now, shows little sign of bowing to the pressure. In Uruguay this week, a group of EU and Latin American nations met in an effort to find a way out of the crisis. We'll bring in our guests in a moment. But first, this report from Al Jazeera's Daniel Schweimler in Montevideo.
The meeting brought together divergent views from two continents, hoping to succeed where others have failed, to bridge the huge divide between President Nicolas Maduro and his challenger, Juan Guaido.
I understand that there is a certain frustration or skepticism in many, including many Europeans, including many European Venezuelans, about opening processes that could buy time. This is not the intention of this exercise. The intention of this exercise is to accompany the emergence of a credible electoral process to solve peacefully and democratically the current crisis.
She also said the EU would set up a humanitarian office in Caracas.
Muy buenas tardes y muchas gracias.
That humanitarian aid should not be politicised, that the violence must end and dialogue should prosper. These meetings are the latest international efforts to find peace in Venezuela. But while the two main protagonists in Venezuela itself remain so far apart, they know that their chances of success here are slim. Venezuela's crisis has become a problem for the whole of Latin America. These Uruguayan protesters with their own message for the meeting.
What we want and hope for is that this dialogue will bring peace to Venezuela, the peace that Venezuelans want, the peace that Latin America wants. We all want peace, not military intervention. We know the US has invaded many countries. We don't want an American invasion.
Millions of Venezuelans have fled rising crime and poverty. Cesar has been in Uruguay for 2 years, but said he'd go home tomorrow if Nicolas Maduro resigned.
The
negotiations we've seen throughout Venezuelan history have not changed the government because all the power has been taken. We understand what Uruguay, Mexico, and the other countries are doing. It's excellent, but until Maduro resigns, we can't have a dialogue.
Both sides agree they want peace, democracy and prosperity in Venezuela. But it's still not clear, despite the best efforts of the international community, whether they're any closer to achieving it. Daniel Schweimler, Al Jazeera, Montevideo.
Well, as Daniel was saying there, the EU says humanitarian aid should not be politicised. However, as Alessandro Rampietti reports from the Venezuela-Colombia border, that is exactly what's happening now.
Honking their horns, 2 large articulated lorries and 6 smaller trucks arrived in the border city of Cucuta, carrying the aid relief elements sent by the United States Relief Agency, USAID. This is part of the larger plan by the Venezuelan opposition together with its international supporters to try and start a humanitarian corridor inside Venezuela. But it will not be easy given the fact that President Nicolas Maduro remains steadfast in its refusal to let the aid in. The bridge called Las Tienditas that should become the humanitarian corridor is blocked on the Venezuelan side with barriers and large trucks. The aid will be brought, or is being brought now, inside a warehouse where it will be stored for the next few days. We know that there is food and medical supplies much needed by the Venezuelan population, and we'll get more details the morning of Friday when the U.S. authorities here, together with the Colombian government, and 4 deputies from the Venezuelan National Assembly will give a press conference and give us more details of the aid and their plans on how to bring it inside Venezuela.
Let's bring in our guests today. Joining us from Paris is Guillaume Long, Associate Research Fellow at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs and a former Ecuadorian Minister of Foreign Affairs. Joining us on Skype from Caracas, Phil Gunson, a senior analyst covering the Andes region for the International Crisis Group. And in Atlanta, we'll have Charles Shapiro, President of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta and a former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela. Welcome to you all. Phil Gunson in Caracas, why is all this pressure on Nicolas Maduro not going anyplace?
A couple of reasons, I think. One is that the military have remained loyal. That's the Venezuelan military. This is a regime in which the military play a very important role. Without their support, Mr. Maduro, who is faced with opposition from 80 to 90% of the population, couldn't survive. They've remained loyal. But on the other hand, there's also the question of whether he has any good alternatives. Mr. Maduro is accused of all sorts of things, from traffickers to possible stupidity, and he has a pretty good idea that what awaits him if he does leave power may be a jail cell.
Guillaume Long in Paris, why is the High Command remaining loyal to him?
Hi, thanks for having me on. I think there are a number of variables to explain the military's loyalty. Certainly, Venezuelan society has been increasingly militarized, starting probably from the 2002 coup onwards. Chavez was very, very careful to make sure, given the hostility of the United States, but also the hostility of a significant proportion of the Venezuelan opposition, that he needed the military on his side. And I think he largely succeeded in doing this, which has been unfortunate in a number of ways, because we've seen as the Maduro government has gotten more and more threatened, or felt more and more isolated, or threatened, I think is the correct term. He's given more and more power to this military, including in areas of economic management of the country, which have been, I think, have had rather disastrous results. But I think the diagnosis is right, and this is something we need to take into account if we want a peaceful solution to this crisis. The military so far is definitely on the side of Nicolas Maduro, and I would say we want to be careful as well with that narrative that all of the Venezuelan population is against Nicolas Maduro. I don't think that's the case. And therefore, we have a sort of stalemate situation that needs to be resolved through peaceful means, negotiations, dialogue, and not through sort of exacerbating tensions and polarization.
Charles Shapiro in Atlanta, you were nodding there listening to Guillaume Long in Paris. But if this is a coup d'etat, has it already in effect failed?
Well, number one, it's not a coup d'etat. If there's been a coup, it's been a self-coup by Nicolas Maduro, who's assumed essentially dictatorial powers in Venezuela. What the international community, the European Union, the Lima Group in the Western Hemisphere, a whole number of countries individually, the Organization of American States, what they're looking for isn't a coup. What they're looking for are free and fair, internationally supervised elections.
Phil Gunson, coming back to you in Caracas, John Bolton is talking about serious consequences out of Washington. Is that saber rattling or something potentially more dangerous?
We really don't know. It could just be a bluff. But I think the problem with this is that Mr. Maduro, especially given the position that we described earlier, Mr. Maduro may be inclined to call that bluff. He may think, and I believe he does, I've been talking this week to people on both sides of this political divide, and I think the government does believe that if it can hang on for a few weeks, for a few months perhaps, then this will blow over, that the bubble of the opposition and the international coalition will burst, and that the regime can perhaps survive at least another year and perhaps indefinitely. There's obviously a risk, and this I think we need to put a lot of emphasis on it. There's obviously a risk that when you bluff like this, or when you rattle sabers, you may find yourself having, in the end, to put your money where your mouth is, as it were, and actually to engage in some kind of military operation. I don't think it would necessarily be a full-scale invasion or anything that looks like it, but there may well be violence before this is over.
From where you are, Guillaume, in Paris, what do you think's driving the US attitude towards this? John Bolton now reportedly has a relatively new, in his mind, axis of evil. That phrase has been attached to his attitude towards Venezuela. The axis of evil is Cuba, Nicaragua and Venezuela. So what's pushing that?
Certainly in Europe, there is, I think, a growing suspicion of a sort of unilateral approach to this crisis, to the kind of US position on Venezuela. It's not a homogeneous European position, as you know. Some countries have recognized the Guaido self-proclaimed presidency. Others haven't. The European Union itself does not have a unanimous stance on recognizing Guaido. And we're seeing, certainly from Mrs. Mogherini yesterday, in Montevideo, much more cautious language, encouraging this incipient dialogue that's starting in Montevideo, calling on a peaceful outcome. And I think this is the kind of language we want to be seeing. As I just said, I think that Venezuela is extremely polarized, that there's a very high risk of civil conflict and civil war, that is already a serious crisis in Venezuela, a very serious crisis, that would be significantly worsened by a military or outcome or an intervention. And I think this is gradually what's happening in Europe. And also I think Europeans are being more and more suspicious with the kind of, well, you just said the saber rattling we're hearing in the United States, the kinds of US people, including the decisions that the U.S. administration has made in terms of who it's putting in charge of this issue. There's a lot of kind of nostalgia with very hawkish Cold War approach on behalf of the United States to Latin America. You know, people like Abrams in Europe, which have a reputation, a number of neocons being involved in this. So I think we're going to see Europeans gradually espouse an approach that's kind of more pro-dialogue, even if within the European Union, as I said, there is no unanimous approach. Some people much more sort of pushing a pro-Guaido approach, others not at all, and calling, well, various positions, but a lot calling for fresh elections and most calling for dialogue.
And Charles, the Russians have offered to mediate here. Why would they do that, secure in the knowledge that that's exactly what Washington would not want to see happening in its Latin American backyard?
I think that's a great idea for the Russians to do. I mean, it's ridiculous on the face of it that Russians could possibly maintain a posture of mediating between the two sides in Venezuela. Russia's got a lot at stake. It's got a large number of investments in the Venezuelan oil sector. And I think the Russians are concerned that the outcome is actually going to end up hurting them financially. They've been very serious about forcing the Venezuelans to pay the debts that they owe to Russia.
Phil Gunson in Caracas, does this crisis have a particular USP, which I guess may be unique to whatever pushes these things when they happen in South America, and it's this: people outside of the country seem reluctant to spell out who they see as being good and who they see as being bad. And on top of that, you get a situation where countries around the world pile in. And can I suggest to you that that might be unique to South American countries?
I'm not sure. I think in many ways this whole Venezuelan situation is extraordinarily unique. I don't recall seeing an international coalition of this kind recognizing a government that, let's be frank, doesn't even control the building in which it holds its sessions. I was in the National Assembly just the other day, and whilst the parliament, which is supposedly the government, was holding a session, down the other end of the corridor, the government's own parallel parliament was holding a session as well. And around the perimeter, there were National Guard, obviously, or at least theoretically, loyal to the government of Nicolas Maduro. This is a really extraordinary situation. It's going to be studied, whether it succeeds or fails, for many years, I suspect, because this idea of putting all your eggs in one basket and going for a massive push to force a government out in favor of a so-called interim government is really unique. I have my doubts as to whether it's going to work, but of course, if it does, then Donald Trump, among others, will presumably be a hero.
But the reality, Guillaume, in Paris is this as well. I mean, almost 300,000 people are already facing a humanitarian disaster. Neither side in this crisis seems particularly bothered about those people.
Well, I think, the humanitarian crisis that's happening now needs to be resolved, and it needs to be resolved through, I think, a negotiated outcome. I think any kind of additional polarization will make the humanitarian crisis worse. Clearly, the US sanctions are not solely responsible for the humanitarian crisis, because I think there were significant mistakes made by the Venezuelan government going back now a number of years economic mismanagement that has to be denounced. But US sanctions are a contributing factor to this humanitarian crisis. There are different ways of calculating this, but generally speaking, people who are looking at these sanctions are looking at between $16 and $18 billion of hurt for the Venezuelan economy in the coming months. There have already been asset seizures for $7 billion in the United States, problems with Venezuela recuperating its gold. And I think it's also in this context that we have to think of the aid that's arriving on the Colombian-Venezuelan border. The UN and the EU have called for not politicizing this aid. In fact, it's one of the tenets of international law. Humanitarian aid should never be politicized. It should never be a political stunt. There is certainly a contradiction between, on the one hand, crippling sanctions that are making this humanitarian crisis worse, and on the other hand, sort of very cosmetic, marginal, compared to the sanctions, aid coming in from the United States. There's a contradiction there, and it does make us reflect upon the fact that we're dealing with a very highly political moment where there's a lot of symbolism and not necessarily some real teeth behind trying to help Venezuelan people make their daily lives better.
Charles Shapiro in Atlanta, would this come to a head more quickly? And would that, in a sense, be a positive thing if the military were to choose sides?
Well, the military essentially has chosen sides thus far. That's what Phil was saying earlier. The military is very carefully allied with the Maduro government, and Maduro has cultivated them for his entire term in office. Unfortunately, in Venezuela, it's the military that turns out in moments of crisis to be the deciding factor. And one hopes that the military will decide that getting food to the Venezuelan people, relieving the crisis caused by the government, not by U.S. sanctions, which only started last week, will be in their long-term interest, in the long-term interests of the Venezuelan military, and in the long-term interests, of course, of the people of Venezuela.
Phil Gunston in Caracas, if Venezuela is it failing because of socialism or despite socialism?
Well, I suppose it depends how you define socialism, which is a word that means different things to different people. This country is failing for a lot of reasons, but most of them have to do with the concentration of power, the elimination of all sorts of checks and balances, and therefore rampant impunity, which leads to corruption on a scale which is really mind-boggling. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that have been stolen from the national exchequer since Chavez originally came to power back in 1999. But also, under the umbrella of that corruption, the installation of an economic policy, which I don't know if you want to call it socialism, but it certainly involves taking into state control vast swathes of the economy, which have therefore, as a direct result, become completely inoperable and unproductive. Most state companies operate at 10% or less of capacity. Some of them have completely ceased to operate. And the reliance on oil money. In other words, you bring in the dollars from the oil and you use it to buy the imports, which you need because you're not producing anything locally. When the dollars start to run scarce because you've stolen them all or because the oil price goes down, then there's no more imports and people start to starve. It's as simple as that, really.
Guillaume, in Paris, was what we saw in Montevideo really just about symbolism? Because, okay, the EU contact group also talking about dialogue, talking about electoral process. Nobody seems particularly or especially concerned about that either.
I mean, definitely the beginning. I mean, it's far from being resolved. But in international relations, dialogue is a slow-moving process, and I think that was a very important step forward. It included a number of actors that are going to be important in this process within the hemisphere, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, and also European countries. And I think that's the way forward. It's not going to be easy. It's going to require, the Montevideo meeting is already speaking of 4 phases, one of dialogue, which is just actually getting people speaking to each other, which is already something important in order to lower tensions. Then clear negotiations, that's the second phase. The third phase, an outcome with commitments that are made, that are signed, that are sort of witnessed on paper. And then finally, the final phase, the implementation. I mean, this is pretty much by the book sort of international negotiations or negotiations between domestic actors, and that's what needs to be pushed forward. I'm not suggesting it's going to be easy. We're already seeing, in fact, unfortunately, the Guaido side saying they don't want to negotiate. Now, if there's going to be this stalemate for a long time, and Phil Gunson was suggesting it could last a very long time, certainly if the army doesn't budge, it could last for a long time, then maybe Guaido, and if he has the backing of the United States, so he may feel emboldened that now is the time to not negotiate. But, over time, he might, I think one of the things the Europeans should do is certainly lean on him heavily, because Maduro said he would negotiate. Guaido needs to say the same. And maybe we'll have an outcome which could resemble a number of things, including new elections. I mean, all sorts of outcomes are possible. But I think that's the way forward, and I think that's what countries should be committed to.
Charles Shapiro in Atlanta, is there an off-ramp for this crisis?
Well, the off-ramp for this crisis is elections. I'd like to go back. At the Montevideo session, there seemed to be a real split. The European countries represented there clearly what they want are new elections, internationally supervised elections in Venezuela. What Mexico and Uruguay want appears to be a process that leads to a process, a dialogue leading to dialogue. Strikes me that really is a non-starter, and that's the response that you're getting from Guaido, as I understand it. This country's in crisis. It needs an off-ramp, and that off-ramp is elections.
Phil, who's going to blink first?
Supposing neither side blinks, that's what I really fear. I mean, I think what both the other guests have been talking about is very important. That we, at Crisis Group, we believe in negotiated solutions, but we don't believe in empty dialogue. And I read the Montevideo meeting yesterday slightly differently. I think Mexico was the one that came out very isolated from that. Mexico sticking to a position of kind of endless dialogue, whereas I think the European Union's contact group gained strength, and it's a process which focuses very clearly on elections, on confidence-building measures, on moving this towards a solution, which, if you read between the lines, does not include President Maduro. The Bolivians, interestingly enough, who are very close to the Maduro government, remained within the contact group, even though they didn't sign the final communique. And Uruguay, which came into the meeting sort of hand in hand with Mexico, did sign the communique and has remained with the contact groups. I think that there's a sense in which the outcome yesterday really favoured negotiation over the sort of empty, vacuous dialogue that Mr. Maduro has been very fond of in the past. And it's true, just one final point, it's true that Guaido and the opposition don't see any point in talking at the moment because they have the US behind them and they feel strong. But that's not necessarily going to be the case a little way down the road if this isn't resolved extremely quickly through the resignation of Mr. Maduro or the military deciding to back down and cease supporting him.
Which is an interesting point to draw our discussion to a close. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Thank you to our guests. They were Phil Gunson, Guillaume Long and Charles Shapiro. And thank you to you too for your company. You can see the show again anytime on the website, aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also keep up with the conversation on Twitter at AJ Inside Story, or tweet me. I'll tweet you back. I'm at Peter Dobby1. From me, Peter Dobby, and the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.